Hello, today is Thursday, October 29th, 2020. My name is Jackie Pelota, and I'm here interviewing Jose Medina for the Voces Oral History Center at the University of Texas at Austin. Please know that this interview will be placed in the Nettie Lee Benson Latin American Collection at the University of Texas at Austin. If there is anything you do not wish to answer or talk about, I will honor your wishes. Also, if there's something you want to talk about, please bring it up and we'll talk about it. Because we're not conducting this interview in person, I need to record you consenting. So I'll ask you a series of 5 questions. Please say, yes, I agree, or no, I do not agree after each one. There are 2 questions, though, that we need to make sure you agree to before we go on. Voces wishes to archive your interview along with any other photographs and other documentation at the Benson Library at UT Austin. We will retain copyright of the interview and any other materials you donate to Voces. Do you give Voces consent to archive your interview and your materials at the Benson Library?
Yes, I agree.
Do you grant Voces copyright over the interview and any material you provide?
Yes, I agree.
Do you agree to allow us to post this interview on the internet where it may be viewed by people around the world?
Yes, I agree.
Thank you. So we have other questions that you already filled out in the pre-interview form, and we use that form to help in research. So the entire form is kept in a secure Voces server, and before we send it over to the Benson Library, we would have stripped out any contact information for yourself or family members. So that part is not a part of your public file. Your public file will only be accessible at the Benson Library. Do you wish for us to share the rest of your interview in your public file available to researchers at the Benson?
Yes, I agree.
On occasion, Voces receives requests from journalists who wish to contact our interview subjects. We only deal with legitimate news outlets. Do you give consent for us to share your phone numbers or your email with journalists?
Yes, I agree.
Thank you, Jose. I appreciate you bearing with me. This is kind of how we have to do it now via Zoom. But we can start off by having you just tell me a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So my name is Jose Raul Medina. I'm a Cuban-American, born March 22nd, 1990 in Hialeah, Florida. Both of my parents came to the US in 1988 separately. They knew each other from Cuba, and they basically met each other again when they were both in Miami. Grew up in a public school system for the most part, started at Henry M. Flagler, pretty close to my house, and went to Ponce de Leon, then ended my public school career at G. Holmes Braddock Senior High. After G. Holmes Braddock Senior High, I applied to a few colleges and was waitlisted at most of them, predominantly due to late test scores. So I enrolled in Miami-Dade College's Wolfson campus, and I took 2 years worth of classes there to receive an associate's degree in political science. It was after that that I transferred to the University of Chicago on a full ride Odyssey scholarship, and I continued my political science studies. Wrote a thesis on post-colonial responses to violence and nonviolence, specifically in Sri Lanka. And after that, I thought that I would be going into law. During my time at the University of Chicago, I worked at the Miami-Dade College Law Center as a project assistant. I also worked at the Miami-Dade County Law Library and also was an intern at the 11th Judicial Circuit under Judge Gil Freeman. Took a job in consumer protection, and I liked the type of work, but I knew that being in the legal world was something that I thought wouldn't allow me to express my creative and analytic abilities as much as I would have liked. So I then decided to go back to school. So I applied to a couple of programs, got into the University of Chicago's Committee on International Relations, and I studied international relations and became a data privacy scholar. My research at the time there focused on mass surveillance, specifically conducted by government and corporate entities, and how that level of surveillance affected and molded the social and legal apparatus within the United States and its democratic systems. Thought this was really interesting, thought I wanted to do a PhD, so I left, rather graduated from the program, and I took a few odd jobs here and there, and then I eventually stumbled upon the Cambridge Innovation Center down in Miami. As it was about to launch, I was the second person hired, eventually grew to a team of 14, helped with the launch, stayed on as a relationship manager, was in a hybrid sales, operations, strategy, communications, information technology role. And it was very exciting. I got to wear a lot of hats, and it gave me an exposure to the world of business and technology and social impact and innovation and entrepreneurship. And it was a lot of stuff that I didn't really have much experience with on a formal basis / a non-academic basis. So my gap year turned into 3, and then I decided that I should probably continue to round off the skills that I needed that I thought would make me essentially maximize my impact on the world. So with that, I applied to a bunch of different programs, actually, PhDs, MBAs, and then Cornell was kind enough to both admit me and to give me a great financial aid package. So I enrolled in Cornell, where I have concentrated on corporate finance and digital technologies, and I spent my summer at Accenture within their social impact division called their development partnerships, and there I was working on digital strategy projects specifically with international NGOs in North and South America. This was a remote internship given the COVID-19 pandemic, and I have been here in Ithaca, New York, essentially since early January 2020 and have not left. But that is essentially who I am, and happy to go deeper on any of that.
Thank you. That was super thorough. I think that's the most thorough intro I've had, which is awesome. So you talked about a lot of things, but you talked about in the end how your internship due to COVID is now remote or was remote. How was that experience? I'm sure as somebody that has, you've worked previously in person in settings, and so how was that virtual internship with Accenture different, kind of given the circumstances?
So I knew to an extent that things would be different given COVID, and I suspected that there would be a couple of different scenarios. Scenario number 1, which was the one that I was most afraid of, was that everything would be exactly the same, and that I would still have to go into the office, and I would have to wear masks, and I'd have to be careful, and I'd still have to travel to client sites. As you can imagine, something like consulting, specifically strategy consulting, is something that tends to require a lot of travel, like 4 or 5 days a week. Had I been in person and had I not been in COVID, one of my projects was in South Africa. Another one of my projects would have been in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And then I had a +1 project that was in Toronto. So I would have been flying internationally, essentially, to all of my engagements. So that's something that would have made me very nervous, because I've been very, very conservative with regards to my behavior and activity during COVID. The second option would have been, we would have been remote to an extent, and it would have been exactly the same, except we would have been doing everything online, and that's what ended up happening. Other options that my classmates went through in their internships was they're either truncated significantly, either to 6 weeks and in some cases 2 weeks. And some of my classmates had their internships canceled altogether, right? So that's giving an overview of sort of my expectations going in, and what ended up happening was sort of the most optimal it could have been given the circumstances. In terms of what I was looking for and what I wanted, coming from somewhere like the Cambridge Innovation Center, where our main product was community, right? And the idea of the serendipitous encounter with someone that is also motivated to make their local community and global community a better place. One of the things that drew me to Accenture was the fact that it also had that promise of community and friendship and relationship development and getting to know the people that you're working with on a very profound level. I actually scheduled a trek to Accenture and some other firms with a group of classmates November of 2019, and Accenture completely blew me away. And that was one of the reasons that I picked it in terms of what I thought its promise was to really give me that community-oriented experience. So as I went into Accenture, it was so interesting. I heard a lot of different opinions from a bunch of other people that had been there for a longer time. And, you know, of course, no one had ever been in a situation like a pandemic where they completely had to rescope and reorient how they conducted their day-to-days. What someone mentioned sort of in passing was 50% of consulting is doing work and 50% of consulting is having dinner and drinks, right? So, and for me, I was like, I wanted to do the dinner, and I also wanted to do the engagements, right? But forming those relationships and being chummy and really sort of building a rapport that would allow you to really more effectively pinpoint what the business needs were. That's something that I thought I would thrive in, but 100% of the job was grinding and doing the work. And you did have your Microsoft Teams meetings, you had your Zoom meetings, and you know, you are able to build relationships. It's apples and oranges in terms of how those relationships actually are. But yeah, I would say that given the circumstances, the experience was clearly different than what I expected, but I was able to manage my expectations given that I knew the severity of everything that was going on, and that this would be very new for everyone, and that everyone was learning along the way.
So, when did Accenture decide? Because I know typically when it comes to internship offers, you know a good amount ahead of time. And so, when did they decide that this was going to transition remote? And then, kind of how was that communicated? You know, was there frequent communication? Did you have a supervisor reach out?
Yeah, so in terms of timeline, um, to just get a fuller idea of how things went, I had my visit in November. I submitted my application in December. I had my super day, which was the big interview day, around mid-January. And it was a few days after that that I received my offer. So I remember I received my offer on, I believe it was MLK Day. And I remember I waited a little bit to accept the offer because I was in a couple of other interview processes and I wanted to see them to fruition before I dropped off. And then the news about COVID really started kicking off within sort of my sphere of, I guess, engagement sometime around mid-March, right? So that's when people were starting to say, oh, this could actually be a really big thing. Like we actually need to be more careful about it. Oh, if things get worse, we may have to cancel classes or do different things. I didn't know what to expect, but again, I sort of kept an eye on the news and an ear into the public to see kind of what was going on. Once things began to shut down, that's when Accenture very proactively started sending us communications and saying, there's a global pandemic going on, and we want to make sure that we're doing everything in our power to give you the right experience while also balancing the needs of the business and what we need to do as a firm. So rest assured, you can send us any questions that you have, but we'll be following up in the coming weeks to let you know how we're going to adjust, right? A few weeks later, sure enough, they write back and they're like, we're migrating this internship to a completely virtual format. So you're going to be doing all of the same work, except you're going to be doing it from home or wherever you best see fit. So communication, I would say, happened like twice a month-ish, but anytime a communication was sent, it was quite thorough and it answered a lot of questions that were personally on my mind and some questions that I didn't even really have that was still good to know about. So overall, I would say in terms of their corporate office communications, they handled it very well. And I never felt like I was in the dark or worried about the future of my summer experience.
Well, that's really great to hear. And so you were talking a little bit previously about the challenges, some of the challenges with the nature of just being remote and how building relationships, it looks a little different. And so could you kind of walk me through what a day, I know there's maybe no such thing as a typical day, but what a day looked like for you during your virtual internship?
Certainly. So during my time at the internship, uh, I had a very atypical experience, even in the context of a pandemic, because unlike most of my peers, I was actually staffed on 3 projects over the summer. The norm is usually 1 and maybe an additional project that you do on your spare time if you're waiting for something to happen. That said, I had 3 different managers over the course of my projects. So one of the challenges was building rapport with everyone that I was coming across, especially given that one of these projects was 4 weeks, one of these projects was 3, another one of these projects was 4, right? So how do you sort of balance that? To answer more specifically about the day-to-day, it's a bit different at the beginning, so I'll fast forward a little and maybe 3 weeks in. By that point, I knew what my team was going to be looking like for most of my engagements. So I set up dailies with my supervisors when they were available, and I also set up dailies with the 2 other interns on my team. And something that was very satisfying to me over my experience is that I actually got to take on an informal managerial role with the undergraduate interns that were within my team, because I was more readily accessible to them than my supervisors, who were also just completely swamped with their COVID projects. I'd say between my 3 managers, and I would say between 2 of them specifically, they must have been overseeing 30 to 40 different projects. So very difficult to get time on their calendar, very difficult to review things. So we were in a lot of ways very self-sufficient in that regard. So we would have our daily stand-up, we would determine what work needed to get done, we would scope out the deliverables and what we needed to do for our client or internally, and then we would begin to grind. So usually these meetings took place at around 9 a.m.-ish. I tried to do them at around 9:30 to give my intern some time to also relax and get some sleep. And then we would have meetings after that to actually have working sessions. So we would work, we would keep our cameras on, we would interject and say, hey, I actually need this data, or hey, have you finished this analysis? And we would check in on each other to see what the progress was. Then we would take a little break for lunch. Then we would have professional development meetings or meetings with other people within the company. If we had specific interest areas within the company, whether it was retail, whether it was design, whether it was project management in general, there were people at the firm that wanted to talk to you about it. And then we would occasionally have client meetings in the afternoons if we had a day that a client meeting was scheduled. And after that, we would have debriefs, we would have preparatory sessions for the next day, and then we would have maybe another working session to just close the loop on anything that we needed immediate feedback for before we went completely independent into the night. So yeah, the day-to-day, I would say, was pretty standard in that sense. There were some days that the client work was a bit more heavy, and we may have been doing a workshop for 3 to 4 hours, doing knowledge inventories, figuring out if we needed to rescope, looking at budgetary considerations, seeing what our timeline was, and if we were ahead of schedule, behind schedule, and so on. So yeah, I would say it would be probably different had we been in person, because there would have been the travel component, and given that we would have been on site, it's possible that we would have been working longer hours as well. But yeah, I would say that is sort of the bird's eye view of the day-to-day.
It sounded like y'all were pretty busy. I mean, that seemed very busy to me. I know you said normally you'd be working longer hours in person, but and kind of considering how COVID-19 has also created somewhat of an economic downturn. Did that impact you all? Because I feel like what you shared, y'all were pretty busy. And so how did that play out? And I know you talked about kind of clients and what What type of clients did you all work with through Accenture?
Yeah, your intuition was correct. I think economically, the firm definitely saw a shift in the mix of its work. Um, Fortunately for the firm, and unfortunately for the world, obviously, because no part of this pandemic has been like positive or net positive, even, right? Um, but we, as a firm, or rather Accenture as a firm, is sort of the preeminent business technology firm globally, right? They have over 500,000 employees, and most of them have expertise in some sort of technical system, right? So, as you can imagine, a lot of the clients that Accenture has are working pretty strictly within the business technology space, and business technology, as you can imagine, has completely taken off. A lot of companies have been 10xing, 100xing in terms of just like exponential growth to their sales, their teams, and sort of the scope of work that they're doing as well, right? So beyond technology companies, as you can imagine, healthcare systems have also seen huge upswings in the type of work that they're requesting from consulting companies, specifically in terms of operational transformation, capacity building, making sure that their short-term strategy is aligned with their long-term strategy, and making sure that they can really maximize their ability to save human lives, right? So we had one very large client in the medical industry that I'm probably not allowed to disclose, but a Google search may give it away. But we had a lot of work with that client. I know that our strategy division is about 9,000 people, or was about 9,000 people in the US when I was there. And I believe that about like 500 people were staffed on that one client project. So imagine like 500 people like working like on one project for a company and not being part of that company. It's actually quite intense to just even manage that process. Beyond business technology and healthcare technology on the commercial side, I mentioned that I was within development partnerships, which is their social impact arm. Huge upswing on the amount of work that was being sold and the amount of work that was being contracted out of ADP, development partnerships, as a result of COVID. Extremely vulnerable populations that were in terrible conditions before COVID were just completely thrown for a loop when the pandemic happened, right? So many systems already lacked infrastructures, and COVID in many ways was a force multiplier and an intensifier for a lot of the issues that they were going through. So a big part of my work was within the educations and livelihood division of the social impact arm. And that worked pretty closely with refugee populations. And as you can imagine, stability in normal terms is already hard to come across. The immensity of the destabilizing force that a pandemic brought about these populations was truly regrettable and enormous in scope. And that meant that over the summer, more interns than probably ever before were staffed on social impact projects, either in conjunction with large international NGOs or large charities or large philanthropic organizations or government arms that are working specifically on relief efforts. So something that I can talk to is one of my projects that was based in Sao Paulo, Brazil. We were working with a small NGO there. It was maybe like a team of like 3 main people and a couple of contractors here and there. And what they did was they worked with people that were displaced in the greater Latin American refugee crisis, particularly in Venezuela. And they were trying to assimilate them into Brazilian culture, given that assimilation into Brazilian culture for non-Brazilians has become substantially more difficult over the years, given a variety of different social, economic, and political factors. One thing that they were doing before COVID was a program where they would reskill migrants from other countries and prepare them to become entrepreneurs in Brazil, either as teachers, freelancers, chefs, etc., given whatever was popular in Brazil at the time in terms of business infrastructure. This was a physical program, and they did a pilot, I believe it was November of last year. And when COVID hit, their demand went much higher, and they realized they couldn't do a physical program anymore. So not only were they trying to scale the program up, but they were also trying to digitize it. So that was one of the big things that we were working on. I know another one of my colleagues was working on a really incredible project with actually a nonprofit provider of vaccines. Which was a fascinating project in itself. I'm not sure how much I'm allowed to disclose on that, but I know that she was working very rigorously and diligently on making sure that she was able to serve the population that she was serving adequately.
And so I know, you're since gone now, but kind of as this pandemic has evolved, have you seen any more initiatives like that, like within Accenture? Because I know some people, I guess, think that the pandemic is getting better, and so kind of have you kept in touch with folks to kind of just see how things have progressed?
A little bit. There's a lot of the work that began is still going on. With Accenture and with consulting in general, work tends to happen in phases. So there's always sort of like the early end of a project where you essentially put together the strategy for it, and then maybe you go into an implementation component, or maybe you go into a due diligence component of some sort. Certain companies have certain partners that they like to work with for certain parts of the project. So usually funding arms will come in and they'll have internal consulting divisions that they then dispatch into the client sites to figure out what they can do. But I suspect a lot of the healthcare work is very much going on. I have a friend at a different company that actually contracts work with Accenture, and they're about to renew a contract with them, keeping it a bit vague in terms of just like keeping privacy, but it is a pretty large contract at a pretty large tech company, and they're one of the tech companies that have actually been hit by COVID a bit harder than other ones. So very interesting to see those developments. But yeah, although in terms of sort of like social and economic and political beliefs about COVID in the mainstream are sort of suggesting that things aren't slowing down, the companies that are on the front lines are very much still keeping it at top of mind, and they don't seem to have slowed down on their ability to try to address it as long as it's continuing.
And so I want to transition us, because I believe you had said that you've been in Ithaca the whole time during the pandemic. And so I want to have you kind of share what that experience has been like. And I know you said you're from Miami and your parents are in Miami. And so kind of how has that been different from their own experiences in a way?
Yeah, there have been some differences in terms of how my parents have been handling this and how I've been handling it, just given the tremendous differences between how Ithaca has handled it and how Miami has handled it. So sort of starting from the top, I last visited Miami December 2019 and left early January 2020 because I see my family essentially every break I get. I only really have my mom and dad for the most part, and I'm not particularly close with anyone else in my family. And I also don't have siblings. So I have a very close relationship with mom and dad. I got back in January, and my plan was that I would celebrate my 30th birthday in Miami, which happened to fall on spring break. And that was around the time that everything began to shut down. So I needed to make an executive decision And it was, do I pack up all of my things and go back to Miami and spend essentially the rest of the academic year slash summer slash like business school career there and do everything remotely? Or do I stay in Ithaca until I find out what needs to happen, right? And a lot of considerations went into that. One of the big ones was the idea of just sunk costs relating to rent. I had a lease and I wouldn't have been able to break it, essentially. And then I also knew that I had no idea what was actually going to happen in the next couple of weeks. I think everyone was kind of split in thinking, okay, COVID is going to be like a week-long thing. And some people were like, this is going to be a month. And some people are like, this is going to be a year. And some people were like, this is going to go on indefinitely and we have no idea what to do. So we need to prepare for the worst. So not knowing, I went with the conservative estimate, and it was, I'm not going to do anything until the CDC or the WHO or otherwise some global health advisory is able to give more insight as to what's going on, right? So I had a plane ticket to Miami for my birthday, canceled it, rebooked one for a week later, thinking that it would only be a week, right? And then as I saw things actually getting worse, I realized that I had to cancel that as well. And part of my decision-making calculus for that was, well, you're probably familiar with Miami, but for the viewers that may not be as familiar with Miami, spring break is a very big deal in Miami, and it's not simply a local thing, it's a global phenomenon. So you have people coming in from all over the world to go to South Beach, party in the sand, run a hotel, and do that for like a week, 2 weeks, whatever. Spring break tends to be associated with reckless behavior, even when there's not a pandemic. So if you can imagine, I guess 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 people clustered along a beach, drinking, playing volleyball, sharing food, and engaging in, I guess, behavior that would be completely unacceptable during a pandemic, you realize that there is a high likelihood of a critical mass of COVID assembling in a very specific location. And just the notion of a super spreader event is something that terrified me. And since I would be flying in, I knew that I would be in an airport likely filled with people that had likely been exposed to COVID. And at that point, the analysis behind COVID was, if you are 70 or older, the mortality rates are much deadlier than someone that's like, under the age of 70. But then I also thought, I don't want to chance it because I don't know what's going to happen to me. And then even if I'm able to survive this, I would be staying with mom and dad, and they are not getting any younger, right? So I went conservative in terms of like how I would react to that. So my experiences during COVID was very much like, this is a pandemic and it's serious. And I'm in a college town where I also suspect that people may not be the most responsible / take it super seriously. So for the first 10 weeks of COVID, I left my house twice. And the only reason that I left my house twice was to get groceries because I'd run out of fruits and juices, right? And then as I saw things improving a little bit, I would leave the house once a week and go on like a 3-hour walk in the middle of nowhere, like by a creek, by a forest, a hiking trail, something that would allow me to be outdoors and get some fresh air that also wouldn't expose me to people and that I wouldn't expose myself to people in terms of communicating COVID, right? So my experience was very much like, I'm going to be in my apartment 24/7 until I see things getting a little better in my local community. That was Ithaca. And Ithaca overall, something worth mentioning, President Pollock decided to shut everything down like right at the end of March. So our spring break went from 1 week to about 3 to 4. And then everything was remote from that day forward. So students were asked to go home. The students that were international students were asked to go back to their home countries as well. And some of them weren't able to. So the sort of end product was, you don't have to go home, but you have to leave Ithaca, right? So most of the people that stayed were professional school students. It tend to be, in theory, less reckless than someone who's college age and wants to party and wants to spend time with friends and sees that level of like social cohesion more important than potentially contracting a disease that they think they may be immune to, right? So that's Ithaca. With mom and dad in Miami, people weren't following the rules. People weren't wearing masks. People weren't social distancing. People didn't take it seriously. Things slowly began to shut down in terms of business decisions, but politically and policy-wise, it took a while for our legislators and decision makers to make sort of this affirmative, like, we shouldn't be open anymore, at least until we figure out how to make things a little better. So my mom is a stay-at-home mom. So she already didn't really leave the house too much. She would leave maybe like 2-3 times a week to take a trip, get some fresh air. She would walk in like outdoor spaces and just enjoy the weather. And my dad is a car salesman. And, you know, surprisingly, car sales didn't really slow down too much during COVID. So they still needed people to work. And the way that it was initially handled by my dad's car dealership was, we're not shutting down, just be careful, right? And then as things got worse, the energy was more so, okay, we're not shutting down yet, but you don't have to be here all the time. So we're cutting everyone's hours in half. Some of you will come in 3 days a week. Some of you will come in 3 days a week, and we'll sort of do shifts until things get better. So that's what happened. My dad needing to work would wear a mask. He'd wear rubber gloves. He'd wear one of those like big face visors that came down to your chin. And you know, thank goodness they've been healthy and they haven't run into any medical issues during that time, but they've also been very safe. They haven't done any sort of indoor gatherings, outdoor gatherings. My mom and dad essentially live with each other and they live alone. They haven't spent any time with friends. So yeah, they've also been very mindful. So their experience has kind of tracked to mine, but in some senses, I've had more liberty to do more things that suggest like a normal and like thoughtful living situation than like my parents would be able to, because like 10% of the people in our building probably wear masks regularly. And when I say our building, I mean the building that my mom and dad are living in, whereas here, you'll never see anyone without a mask. And even when people are running, they'll have their masks in their hands. And if they see someone like 30 feet away, that's when they'll put their mask over their mouth and continue. So just culturally, the idea of mindfulness around COVID has been sort of day and night in terms of how people have been treating it.
Can you speak more to that, and can you speak more, because I mean, I know you were alluding to it a little earlier, talking about just the political differences as well, but could you expand upon that?
Sure. So I'm trying to figure out how to express this. So somewhere like Ithaca, especially somewhere like Cornell, there's clearly some level of like stakeholder management that is geared towards the more elite, the more affluent, the more wealthy, right? Or at the very least, like more intellectual, right? As an institution, it's obviously an Ivy League institution, so the stakeholder relationships that they're managing are very much donors that are like, anything that you do to damage our reputation is going to come back to haunt you. We will pull our like annual contributions. Like there are financial and political motivations essentially for the school to behave a certain way, but I'll also give the school credit and suspect that Martha Pollock is someone that fundamentally cares about the student population and wants to make sure that they don't get sick. And she also knows that if under her leadership there is an event where hundreds and thousands of people die, that she will be held responsible for it, regardless of how you slice the pie, right? So that was a bit of a cynical view and a bit more of a charitable view. I think there's somewhere kind of halfway that you can find, and it's you have to do the right thing, and also the right thing will often translate to the right thing for the stakeholders highest up, right? So I think given that, you have leadership at the university level where their main goal isn't necessarily to keep things open, right? But the goal is more so to shut things down and have things under control immediately, right? I wonder to what extent that's motivated by the school thinking, if we don't handle the situation properly, then people may transfer, they may withdraw, they may decide to not pay tuition, they might decide to go on pause. There could be any number of things that could potentially ruin the relationship between student and institution or alumni and institution. And I think the alumni and institution one is something that the school like really cares about. So I think to that extent, it's important to recognize that the people that Cornell is protecting is also a very specific type of person, if that makes sense. So when I think about Miami and sort of who the stakeholders there are, I feel like that's particularly difficult for me to untangle because I can't really speak to the motivations of those people as clearly because at Cornell, I've been in the thick of it and I've seen all of the communications and I've read between the lines a little bit. I would say when it comes to certain political officials and certain decision makers and even business leaders that lobby political officials to have certain economic and like financial outcomes, right? There just seems to be a callous disregard for human life and well-being. And, you know, I don't think this goes without precedent, right? If you look at even just like the track record of someone like Mayor Jimenez, for example, right? When you see sort of like his inability to move more quickly on COVID, and then you sort of compare that to his record with ICE and his stance on Miami as a sanctuary city and how he wanted to lift that, you sort of see kind of this pattern of, well, you know, people will sort of deal with it on their own and it's not my responsibility, or like it's not my job to sort of like answer to COVID. This is like a health crisis. I'm just the mayor, right? But then again, I don't know. That's conjecture to an extent for me, you know. So I'll be a little more conservative on that just because I don't think I can speak to it very much. But I also think that there is this Miami stereotype of we're a party city, right? And people want to have a good time, and like anything that inhibits that is just like un-American, like un-Miami. So one example that I can probably speak to is back when I was in Miami, I would consider myself a part of the electronic music scene down there, both as an artist and as like a supporter of other artists. I'd go to events, I'd play shows, and I would have a good time, right? And then things started shutting down, and then people there saw it as, oh, well, this isn't something that needs to happen. So you have a bunch of people within that community that are deciding to host secret house parties off the record that are text invite only. And you see 50 people in someone's cramped living room, windows closed, and no one's wearing masks, right? So I feel like culturally there are also sort of these bids for rejecting this idea that COVID is something that's causing harm to others, right? And I think there's a little bit of that in a college town as well, because you also have people that are like, we're young, we're gonna party, but I think just like governance in general has made a really big difference in how people have been just dealing with the consequences of COVID.
Thank you for sharing all that. And then for folks that, you know, maybe don't know, because you know, we don't know who's going to watch this. Can you share a little bit more about Cornell's demographic makeup? You don't have to give me like all the numbers, but you know.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could speak to it in sort of more specific strokes. I know that we're a predominantly white institution. Um, Not a lot of Latinos, not a lot of Black and African American students, a lot of Asians, you know, spanning China, India, and a couple of other Southeast Asian places, a few European students, a few Canadian students. But yeah, I would say the demographics at Cornell are the demographics that you would expect to find at another peer institution like a Brown or a Harvard or a Stanford, right? Predominantly white with a bit of diversity, but yeah, in terms of, I guess, like class distribution, I'd say like you definitely have a lot of people in the community that are quite wealthy, and you have a lot of people that are here on need-based scholarships, right? I am closer to the latter. So yeah, but I wish I could speak to that more. I unfortunately don't really have too much data on that off the top of my head.
No, and that's definitely helpful. I think putting it into perspective, especially with what you were saying about the university response. And so, is there anything else that the university has done to support you all during this time, kind of considering what you said, you know, not everyone is affluent. So did they, I know some universities provided like, you know, relief aid or other types of resources?
Yeah, Cornell had a couple of different programs across different divisions and institutions within the school that provided travel stipends to students that were going back. They provided stipends for rent and housing. They provided some general stipends for food and essentials. There were a couple of grant-based programs that people could apply to demonstrate need. I personally applied for one and got, I think it was about $500 back. So that was really nice. And I used that towards mostly food. I do want to mention, despite all of this assistance, Cornell still decided to raise tuition. So I had to pay an additional $5,000 this academic year. And, you know, it was like fine insofar as like I still had my scholarship and the loans that I took out, I didn't have to really adjust. But to raise tuition during a pandemic, I felt was a bit not generous if I wanted to be charitable. But yeah, but you know, to an extent, I guess I can also make an effort to understand why they would need to raise tuition in the middle of a situation where they may be struggling financially relatively more than they would have been had the pandemic not been happening, right? So there's also that level of nuance to it. But you know, as a student, I find that it's uh, I would say the best expression would be like read the room, right? A $5,000 tuition hike, in light of like all of these like stipends and like grants that you're putting together for the benefit of the student body, it sends mixed signals about how you want to help, right? Especially since we're fully remote, and there's of course like the whole discourse of like, why are we paying $60,000 a year for Zoom, right? So, but yeah, that's a bit of a different story, I would say.
And so talking about that tuition increase, did Did they communicate that to you? How did they communicate that to you? Did you just find out when you were logging online to pay your tuition bill? What did that look like?
It was definitely I logged in and I saw a number that seemed higher than the number from the previous year, and I looked at the history and I was like, oh, did something happen with my loan? And then I checked and there was a tuition increase, um, which was very bizarre. And I'll I'll give them a bit of the benefit of the doubt and say like maybe I was a bit clueless and missed an email, but I also think that to an extent tuition increases are expected year over year. I think that in general, like tuition increases are anywhere between like 3 to 5% consistently. And sometimes that'll happen on a yearly basis. Sometimes it'll happen every other year. It really depends on the school and what their like tuition increase strategy is. But yeah, tuition in this country, specifically in private institutions, has increased like quite dramatically over the past like 20, 30 years. So not surprising, but a bit disappointing, to be sure.
And this is just more of a follow-up probing question, but and I don't want to assume because I know not all Ivies are the same, but don't most Ivies have a pretty large endowment to support students for certain things?
Yeah, great intuition. Cornell definitely has a multi-billion-dollar endowment, as do most of its peer institutions, but there is a level of restriction to what you can unlock endowment funds for because they're readily controlled by essentially the fund managers, and the endowments are also governed by a set of facilities and regulations at sort of like the state and federal level as well. So a lot of people are like, well, just like dig into your endowment, and a lot of people are like, we can't. And it's interesting because there are a lot of discussions about, as you can imagine, there's a national discussion going on relating to divestment, right? And I know the University of Chicago had a big like divest from fossil fuels campaign, basically from the moment that I got there, and it continued going. And I think they've made some progress on that. And I think we've made some progress on the divestment campaign at Cornell as well. But it is tricky because even if you make the moral argument, there are sort of fundamental policy restrictions at what you can do with certain funds. So that's a bit complicated, but yeah, I think there are definitely like additional ways for them to tap into potential means of support, especially as a large institution that conceivably could tap into a line of credit at this time, right? But I don't know what those mechanisms look like too well, but I'd be curious to find out.
And so going back to kind of what you had mentioned about paying $60,000 a year to be on Zoom, other than obviously the changes in the physical location of taking class, has anything else kind of changed for you routine wise? Or I know like some students are funded like through GAs, GRAs, any other changes to kind of your daily routine?
The biggest one is spending less time with friends, right? But beyond that, I would say that I, as a person, didn't change my routine too much. The biggest thing that I've changed, like I guess on a personal basis beyond spending time with friends, is how I conduct work now, right? I have always been someone who has been staunchly anti-work at home. I will not do a single thing related to work minus sending emails like in the comfort of my apartment, right? It's been that way since college, through my professional career, and now. And that's because I've always seen the home as a sanctuary to relax and not worry about anything. So if I ever needed to do work, I'd go to a library, I'd go to a coffee shop, I'd go to like an outdoor sitting space, I'd go to a study room, maybe go to a friend's house if they wanted to have a study party, but working at home was completely anathema to me. And then COVID happened and I realized I don't have the option to study anywhere that isn't home. So I bought a second monitor, I bought a mouse, I bought a keyboard, I got like a desk riser. Um, and yeah, it's been an adjustment, but I think it's gotten better because now I'm also back when I was in Chicago, I lived in studio apartments for the most part, and now I'm in a one bedroom. So I've outfitted my living room into my like office space, and my bedroom is my relaxation space. So I never bring my laptop into my room. Yeah, so it's been good to sort of divide that. In terms of other changes, not necessarily negative ones. I think I like not commuting to class. Ithaca is quite hilly, and I have a very steep hill walking to campus. So anytime the temperature was like more than like 70, I would always work out just like this like awful sweat and this breathlessness on my way to campus. And it's nice to know that I don't have to make the trek anymore, right? Um, I also like the fact that COVID has encouraged me to explore sort of like the beat, like going off the beaten path a little more. So I found like brand new walking trails, creek paths, waterfall paths. I found like little areas and nooks and forests. I found like little caves. And it's all stuff that I wouldn't have bothered to explore on my own had COVID not been around. I simply would have just gone to friends' houses or have gone to like restaurants or have maybe gone on like a hike or two like in the same places. But that level of there's not much else to do, so you should explore and do that. That has been a welcome change in a sea of difficulty. So I would say those are the main changes to my routine.
Would you say that kind of those opportunities to like be outside and kind of be in more off the beaten path, as you mentioned, do you feel like that has really helped kind of like with your own personal mental health during this time?
Certainly, yeah. Had I not, like, if I didn't have access to nature, I don't suspect that I would be in as good a place as I am right now. I know that, and this is a conversation that I've been having with my family recently too, because we're trying to figure out when, if any, like under what circumstances I would come back, right, for winter break, for Thanksgiving, etc. And right now the situation is I'd like to come back because I miss you both, but I also want to be able to maybe do some mindful outdoor activity. So I would love to be able to like drive to like an abandoned part of the beach and sit on the sand and like breathe in the water. I would love to be able to like go to the Everglades and go for a walk or like hit a forest or hit a park and do like everything social distance, wearing my masks, not touching things, not touching my face, like practicing good hygiene, etc. And the conversation is always like, well, I don't know, I think you should just stay in the house. So that level of being in a small apartment with my parents and not being able to leave like 24/7 feels like particularly unappealing. So yeah, and it's something that I obviously wouldn't want to go through, but I know that there are things that I want to do like outside of the social space because like obviously as a person, hopefully I've conveyed that I have like no interest in going to clubs and going to parties and like being around a lot of people that could potentially create like difficulties, you know, but I'm very much a person that enjoys being alone and enjoys reflecting within nature, right? And I do have friends, but my friends are also quite responsible and mindful and thoughtful. So I know that if we were to hang out, that we would able to be socially distanced and that we would do the 6 feet away thing and that we would like do sort of like the hello from afar, right? Um, so all of that is to say, in a situation like COVID, wherever I can find pockets of freedom, um, that's really important to me to make sure that I feel like there are some things that I'm in control over in what seems like a very uncontrollable situation.
And so you you had talked about kind of how your friends are of the similar mindset, kind of like you being a little bit more cautious, more empathetic as to not want to spread. And so how have you been um maintaining connection with them? Like, have you been like Zooming with them, calling them?
Yeah, so I have one of my best friends in Miami was one of my previous coworkers, and we have been we have a recurring movie night on Zoom on Saturday evenings. So we'll watch a movie, we'll talk about it, and then we'll end the call. But it's always like nice to have like a little catch up and to have something that's like more routine. I have some other friends that will FaceTime me occasionally. I'll FaceTime some of my own friends when I'm like on a nice nature walk and they want to see a waterfall or some trees or a creek. Um, yeah, the majority of my interactions have been Zoom based. Um, there are a small handful of friends that I've seen in Ithaca. So, two of my best friends here, we've hung out, I believe, like twice during the pandemic. And one time it was at their place and it was just the three of us. And then another time it was at our place and it was just the three of us. Um, it still makes me feel a little like uncomfortable, despite the fact that I don't know if I've mentioned this in the interview yet, but right now, everyone on campus does a daily check-in where they have to essentially say, like, I haven't been around someone that has COVID. I haven't exhibited any symptoms of COVID. I like don't think I have COVID, right? And once you answer those four questions, if all of them are no, you are green, which means that you're relatively low risk. If you answer yes to any of them, there's a follow-up, additional questions are asked, and then we figure out if it's COVID, if it's something else, et cetera. And then every week we also have to get tested. And that means that essentially everyone in the student body does like a nasal swab, like 10 seconds one nostril, 10 seconds the other nostril. And it's been great in terms of knowing that people are being tested frequently enough that things aren't slipping through the cracks. But even with that knowledge in mind, I still want to be careful and I still want to be mindful. I've had one other friend that I go on walks with maybe like twice every 3 months. And then I have a friend that I see maybe like twice a month as well. And we like also go on walks, but nothing that constitutes reckless behavior, I would say.
Well, that seems like a lot what you were saying about the new policies and procedures related to COVID, like testing every student every week. I mean, and I don't know if you know kind of the inner workings of this, but how is that managed? Like, how do they know you've done your test? How do you get like a little ping on your phone being like, it's time for your tests?
We have a website, dailycheck.cornell.edu, and it is where everything lives. So at 3 a.m. every single day, we get an email so that we see it first thing when we wake up, or see it while we're working on a project very late at night, saying, it's time for your daily check. So you click through and then you fill out the questions, and you're doing this every single day. So you become very familiar with the Daily Check website. Even when you don't get the email, you'll just go there and know that you have to do your daily check. It's part of life, right? Before your testing day, there is a huge blue banner that shows up on the Daily Check site that says, by the way, your daily check is tomorrow, or rather your weekly test is tomorrow. Know that you can schedule it after midnight if you want to come back and schedule. But it's really just like alert, right? And then the next day that you do your daily check, it's like, don't forget to schedule your test. Schedule your test is hyperlinked. And then you click through and you fill out your information. All the tests are done through the Cayuga Health System in partnership with Cornell. And essentially the way that they are able to manage it is that they offer testing I believe it's 5 days a week. I don't think they do testing on Saturdays and Sundays. It's really during school. And the tests are available, I believe, from like 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. And they are available across, I believe, it's 10 to 12 different sites across campus. So some of them are very popular, some of them are less popular. And some days of the week are very popular and some days are not, right? Every student has a day assigned to them. So my daily tests used to be on Tuesdays. And then I realized this is a really bad day for me to do my tests because I'm in class from 8:40 a.m. to 4:10 p.m. with two 15-minute breaks. So I requested a switch to Wednesday when I had relatively less going on, and I got the change to Wednesday. I test at the chapel, which is our chapel that has been outfitted into a testing site. And because I go on a Wednesday and I usually go on a Wednesday afternoon, it's a less heavily trafficked day. So I remember I timed myself 3 weeks ago when I did this. From the moment I opened the door into the chapel to the moment that I opened the door to leave, I took my test and did everything in 1 minute and 28 seconds. So extremely efficient. And they've been managing pretty well. The system is very much a no news is good news system. So unless you have COVID, you will not get an email, right? And when people do get COVID, they are immediately quarantined. They've essentially set up, and I'm actually not 100% sure about this. I've heard it from a few people, but I haven't received external confirmation. So take this with a grain of salt / fact check if like someone is watching, obviously. But we have a hotel school and there's a Marriott that they manage, and they've outfitted some of those hotel rooms into quarantine rooms. So people don't have to interact with the outside world as much. And apparently it's been going really, really well. We had like our biggest spike this year so far, at least this academic year, was week 2, where 36 students tested positive, but all of them were quarantined, and I think all of them recovered. So, and after that, we didn't have any other spikes. The biggest spike after that, I believe, was like a 3-person spike, maybe like a week and a half ago, and they were also quarantined and are dealing with that. But yeah, it's really impressive how thorough they've been during this entire process.
Yeah, that's super awesome. I don't think I've seen that at any other institution, and so that's great. So is it a program only for students, or is it a requirement for everyone at the university, like staff, faculty?
Staff and faculty have to do it as well. Anyone, it's really the way that the daily check expresses it is the reason that we have a daily check and the reason that we have testing is for you to be allowed to come on campus, right? If you're not coming to campus or you're doing everything fully remotely and you're not stepping onto campus, you can apply for like a waiver of some sort. So you can say like, I'm not going to test every single week, and maybe you'll test like bi-weekly or like monthly, right? And by bi-weekly, I mean twice a month, which it's a bad word. But yeah, overall, it's anyone that comes into contact with campus. So like faculty and staff are included, but the caveat is that you can sign certain waivers if you're not going to campus as often, but the exceptions are few and far between.
Yeah, that was my next question. Like, would you say, kind of just from your own experience, folks have generally been compliant and generally been, respectful during this time?
Yeah, I think compliance has been quite good. So right now, how should I express this? I think there's an interesting behavioral component to all of this because the daily check is a self-reporter, right? So you could be having COVID symptoms and you might not want to deal with the school. So you'll just say, yeah, no, click like confirm and hit submit, right? And you have your COVID test and you might have COVID. And then everyone's like, well, wait, you've said in your daily checks that you haven't. And it's like, oh yeah, well, I thought it might've been just like a cold or a flu. So there's like that element to it as well. I think the more you do the daily, like after you do like your 40th daily check, you may be more inclined to be more flexible with how you choose to answer the questions because you feel like you're doing it more so for the benefit of the school than you're doing it for yourself. But in reality, you're doing it for everyone involved, right? So in terms of compliance, I feel like that might be a weird thing that's happening in the minds of some people. But I also think that if people weren't being as compliant, there would be like such an enormous spike in cases. But we've done such a good job isolating it. Like another thing is we're not supposed to have visitors, right? From other cities, other states, anywhere outside of Ithaca. And I think this is important, right? Because like we're really sort of like quarantining like the community as a community. So we're creating kind of like a bubble where if you have like 10 people within the bubble and one of them is sick, you just like take them out and you prevent like another sick person from coming in and like interacting, right? So that's really neat. Yeah, I would say like at a very high level, compliance, I suspect like has been very good. The worst that I've seen, which is like relatively like not even so bad, is occasionally I'll be on a walking trail and someone's running without a mask on. And they'll do the like shirt over nose if they're not wearing their masks. And it seems silly. I feel like they should just have a mask on them, especially if they're going to be on like a public facing running trail. But I think just given like the circumstances of, well, there aren't that many cases, so this is relatively low risk behavior, but I don't know. I feel like better safe than sorry is like 100% of the time.
Yeah, definitely. And so I want to be respectful of your time because I know as a student you have a lot to do. But is there anything else, and I'll just end with this last question. Is there anything else you would like to share with me about your experiences with COVID-19 or during this time in general that I've not asked about yet?
It's a good question. I think we've been pretty thorough for the most part. I think I should mention that I am still looking at what life is going to look like after this. So one thing I didn't mention, I guess, and I think this might be like worth like talking about to some extent. I was admitted to a study abroad program in London, and things in London are not doing super great right now in terms of COVID outbreaks. They are hitting essentially like new records in daily cases are coming close to it. And now I have to figure out, number one, if I'm going to take classes remotely, if I'll go to London, but like later in the semester, if I'm just going to decide to like drop London and do like a different program, like during the spring semester. And part of that is like leaks into like what I'm going to be doing over winter break. And if I get to see my family, and that's a bit complicated. And then I have to figure out like what life after graduation is going to look like as well, because I'm looking at other sort of like career opportunities as well, just given that there may be things that are more conducive to my professional interests and growth that I may not be capturing right now. And I would say that the recruiting process during COVID is particularly brutal because so much of the interview is getting sort of that like person-to-person connection, and it's really hard to do that over Zoom. So yeah, I would mention that at a very high level, but overall I would say at a very high level that this has been such a difficult time, but it's also been a time of extreme self-reflection and really figuring out who you are as a person, what you need the most from life, from yourself, from your friends. And I think spending a little more time really being mindful of how I want to exist and operate in the world has really helped me manage my own expectations with the pandemic and helping my friends and my family through it as well. So yeah, hoping that things improve, but also will be very patient as we hopefully inch towards a better situation.
Well, I just want to take the time to thank you, Jose, for sharing your experiences and stories and just everything that you and your family have gone through during this time. And as you mentioned, kind of continue to go through. And I just appreciate you taking the time because I know it's late and you probably had assignments and things to do.
Yeah, no, it was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.